Don't, it still hurts there. 4 words, whispered by a woman tied to posts under the burning Kansas sun. 4 words that would change everything. Because the man who heard them didn't just cut her free. He listened. They didn't hang her to kill her. They didn't whip her to break her. They did something meaner than both because it let every clean shirt in town stay clean, while a woman learned what pain feels like when it's turned into a public rule. Out on the Kansas flats where the sky looks endless and the wind has nothing to hide, 2 fence posts stood like a dare somebody carved into the land. Rope bit into wood, rope bit into flesh. And between those posts, stretched too wide for mercy, a young woman was held there in the open, wrists tied low, ankles bound high. So her body had no choice but to obey the knots. The August sun of 1887 beat down with the kind of heat that doesn't ask permission. It just takes the moisture from your throat, takes the strength from your legs, takes your dignity if you let it linger long enough. The prairie grass stretched out in every direction, gold and amber, under that merciless sky, and the only sounds were the wind whirring through the stalks and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead, looking for something weaker than itself. Ethan Cole sat his horse on the rise about 300 yards out, and something in his chest tightened before his mind even caught up to what his eyes were seeing. He was 50 years old enough to know better than to stop for trouble, old enough to have learned that getting involved in other people's pain usually just meant adding your own to the pile. He'd spent the last 7 years keeping his head down, working his ranch, speaking to townfolk only when commerce demanded it. The kind of man who rode through life now with his hat pulled low and his thoughts kept closer. But his eyes caught those posts, then caught the rope, then caught the figure suspended between them like something the prairie wanted to forget. And his chest tightened with that old familiar anger that comes when you realize cruelty isn't just being committed, it's being performed. Ethan was the sort of man who didn't look like much at first glance. Medium height, lean build, sun-browned skin that spoke of decades under open sky. He wore a faded blue work shirt, dusty trousers, and a red bandana at his throat that had gone from crimson to rust over the years. His hat was weather-beaten, shaped by rain and sun, and the grip of his own hands into something more comfortable than new. But it was his eyes that made people careful around him. Gray-green like river stones. The kind of eyes that didn't miss much and didn't forget what they saw. He'd been riding back from Hayes City where he'd sold 3 horses to a buyer who asked too many questions and paid too little. The transaction had left him tired and irritable, ready to get home to his small ranch 5 miles west of Dodge City, pour himself a whiskey and let the day bleed out in silence. That plan died the moment he crested the rise. Ethan didn't spur his horse forward, didn't make a show of urgency. He just clicked his tongue once, gentle-like, and the buckskin mare beneath him started down the slope with the kind of trust that comes from years together. His right hand drifted to the rifle in its scabbard, not grabbing it, just touching it. Confirmation. Then his hand moved away again. As he drew closer, the details assembled themselves into something worse than the distance had suggested. The woman was young, 19, maybe 20 at most. Her dress had been blue once, a simple cotton work dress like the kind school teachers wore. Now it was torn at the shoulder, stained with road dust and sweat and something darker that might have been blood. Her dark hair had come loose from whatever pins had held it, hanging in tangles around a face so pale it looked like the sun had tried to burn the life right out of her. But it was her eyes that stopped Ethan's breath. Wide, dark, and so full of the kind of fear that's already counted every second and realized no one's coming. She'd seen him now. Her head lifted slightly and the movement made her wince. A small sound escaped her throat. Not quite a word, not quite a sob, just the kind of noise pain makes when it's been going on too long to have a name anymore. The rope around her wrist was tied to one post low enough that her arms were pulled down and back. The rope around her ankles was tied to the other post high enough that her legs were forced apart and up. The position pulled her body into an arch that no human spine was meant to hold. Stress position, they called it in the war. A way to hurt someone without leaving the kinds of marks that made good men uncomfortable. Ethan had seen it used on Confederate prisoners once back in '64. Watched a sergeant keep a boy in that position for 6 hours, and when they finally cut him down, the boy couldn't walk right for a week. The sergeant had smiled the whole time, said it wasn't torture if you weren't touching them. Ethan had never forgotten that smile. He slid down from his saddle about 10 feet from the posts, close enough to help, far enough to not become another threat. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of sun-heated grass and something else, something human. Sweat and fear and the particular scent of flesh pushed past its limits. The woman's breathing came shallow and quick. Every inhale looked like it had to negotiate with pain first. Her shoulders trembled with the effort of supporting weight they weren't designed to carry. Dust streaked her cheeks. A bruise bloomed dark along her collarbone, spreading down beneath the torn fabric of her dress like spilled ink. And there was something else too, something you couldn't put a finger on until you saw it enough times in enough faces. The look of someone who'd been told their body wasn't theirs anymore, and they were trying to remember how to keep it anyway. She saw him approach and flinched. Not away, toward the ropes, toward the nos, toward whatever came next, because at least known pain has the courtesy of familiarity. Her voice came out rough, scraped raw by sun and crying and hours of breathing through clenched teeth. "Please," she rasped. "Don't. That one word, don't." It carried the weight of every violation she expected, every cruelty she'd already endured, every moment when asking for mercy had only made the pain sharper. Ethan stopped, didn't come closer, didn't reach for his knife yet. He kept his hands exactly where she could see them, down at his sides, open-palmed. That mattered. Out here, hands told the truth before mouths ever did. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. His voice came out low and steady, the same tone he used with spooked horses. "I'm here to get you down." The woman's eyes squeezed shut for a beat, like she couldn't afford to believe him, and was angry at herself for wanting to. When she opened them again, they fixed on his face with desperate intensity, searching for the lie, searching for the trick. When she spoke next, her voice came thin and frightened and strangely specific, like a warning learned the hard way. "Don't, it still hurts there." Those words hung in the August air between them, and Ethan understood them immediately. Understood them in his gut, the way you understand the sound of breaking bone or the smell of infection. She wasn't telling him not to help. She was telling him where the pain lived, where it had taken root in joints and tendons and all the places that don't show pretty bruises. Pain like that doesn't just fade when the ropes come off. Pain like that lingers in the body's memory, makes every touch feel like a threat, even when it isn't. Ethan shifted his stance, reading her posture the way he'd read injured animals his whole life. The way her shoulders curved inward, protecting. The tremor in her arms that spoke of muscles held past their breaking point. The way her ribs fought each breath, expanding against resistance that shouldn't be there. "All right," he murmured. "Tell me where." She swallowed. The movement traveled down her throat like something painful. "Shoulders," she whispered, "and my left side, when I breathe." Ethan nodded once, then he did something most men wouldn't have thought to do. He stepped closer, slow as sunrise, and reached for the knot at her right wrist, then stopped. Looked at her face first. The question wasn't spoken. Permission wasn't asked in words, but it was asked in the pause, in the way his hand hovered near the rope without touching it yet, in the way his eyes stayed on hers instead of on the task. She didn't nod, but she didn't pull away either. That was all he got, and all he needed. Ethan took out a small blade from his pocket. Plain, clean, a working knife, not a weapon. He positioned it against the rope carefully, and instead of just cutting through and letting her weight drop, he did something that revealed the kind of man he was beneath all that silence. He supported her weight first. His left forearm slid under her back, taking the pressure off her shoulder before the rope even loosened. Then he cut. Not a fast slash, but a careful sawing motion that gave him control over how the tension released. The rope frayed, separated, and her right arm came free without the jerking motion that would have torn through already damaged muscles. A small sound escaped her lips. Relief mixed with pain, because even gentle movement hurts when your body's been held wrong for hours. "Easy," Ethan said quietly. "Easy now." He moved to her left wrist. The same process, support first, cut second, control always. By the time her second arm came free, tears were running down her face, but she wasn't sobbing, just leaking. The way a person does when the body gives up on pride because there's no strength left to maintain it. Ethan had to crouch to reach her ankles. The rope there was tied tighter, cutting into flesh that had swollen around it. He could see the raw places where she'd struggled, where hope had made her fight the bonds until blood came. This is going to hurt more coming off, he warned her, but it'll hurt less after. She nodded, or tried to. The motion was barely there. He cut the ankle ropes with the same care, but physics didn't give him much choice about what happened next. As soon as the tension released, her legs dropped and gravity remembered her. Ethan moved fast, not grabbing, not yanking, just catching. His arms came around her as her body sagged, supporting her under the knees and behind the shoulders, keeping pressure off her left side where she'd said it hurt. Her weight fell against him, and for just a moment, she went completely still, like she couldn't quite believe she was being held without being claimed. Her breath hitched sharp against his shoulder. Her hands clutched at his shirt, fingers digging in with surprising strength, the kind of grip that comes from drowning people. "I got you," Ethan said. The words came out rougher than he meant them. "I got you." She shook, half from heat, half from shock, half from the sheer disbelief of being touched without violence. The math didn't work, but trauma never does. Her legs didn't want to work. Ethan could feel it in the way her knees buckled when he tried to set her on her feet, so he didn't force it. He lowered her carefully to her knees first, then guided her back until she could sit in the grass leaning against one of the posts. The same post that had held her captive now became the only thing holding her up. The irony wasn't lost on him. Ethan stood looking around properly for the first time since he'd arrived. The prairie stretched out in every direction, empty of human life. No riders, no wagons, no posse standing proud beside their work. Just the posts, the rope bins hanging limp, and a silence that felt too practiced to be innocent. Towns had a way of watching without showing themselves. Curtains twitching, porches occupied by men who stared at the road like it owed them comfort. Somebody had done this to her. Multiple somebodies most likely, and they'd done it in a place where anyone riding by could see. That was the point, not just punishment. Statement. The woman's voice came again, smaller now, fragile in a way that made Ethan's jaw tighten. "They said nobody would cut me down," she whispered. "They said you don't do that here." Ethan looked down at her, at the torn dress, at the rope marks already darkening into bruises, at the way she held herself like a thing that might break if jostled. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. Like names cost money out here. Like giving it away meant owing something. Then with a breath that trembled, she answered, "Claire Bennett." Ethan knew that name. Not like family, not like a friend. But he'd heard it in town once, spoken with the kind of disdain men use when they want their world simple and someone insists on complicating it. Claire Bennett was the school teacher who didn't laugh at dirty jokes. The woman who wrote letters for widows who couldn't write themselves. The one who'd asked too loud why certain ranch boundaries kept shifting on county maps. The one who'd said calm as scripture in the general store that a town that only protects the powerful isn't a town, it's a trap. Ethan had been standing in the back when she said it. He remembered because the room went quiet the way it goes quiet when truth walks in unwanted and uninvited. "Claire," he said, gently testing the name. "Can you stand if I help you?" She tried. He watched pain flash over her face so fast it almost looked like anger. She made it halfway up before her left side stole her breath and her legs remembered they were done cooperating. Ethan caught her again, and this time there was something different in the way she let him. Not trust exactly. Trust took time. But maybe the beginning of not expecting harm from every hand that touched her. "That's all right," he said. "We're doing it slow." Her hand went to her stomach then, just for a second. A protective gesture so quick and instinctive that she probably didn't even know she'd done it. But Ethan noticed. Noticed the way her palm pressed flat against her belly. Noticed the way her breathing changed when she moved that arm. Noticed the slight rounding beneath the fabric that could have been nothing or could have been everything. He didn't ask. Gentleman's code or maybe coward's code. Either way, he filed it away in the part of his mind that kept track of the things people didn't say. "Don't take me to town," she said suddenly. Desperate, the words tumbling over each other. They'll do it again. They'll make it worse." Ethan looked toward the distant line where Dodge City sat like a bruise on the horizon. He hated town roads, hated what towns turned people into. But he also knew something Claire didn't have right now, the power of witnesses. And he knew something else too. The kind of man who ordered this kind of punishment wasn't afraid of dark. He was afraid of daylight. "I'm taking you to a doctor," Ethan said, Not because I trust this town, because I don't, but because you don't get to die slow out here while they stay comfortable. Her eyes searched his face, trying to find the trick. The angle. The part where this kindness turned into something with teeth. Why she breathed. Why would you? The question landed in Ethan's chest like a punch because it was the same question he'd been asking himself since he crested that rise. Why stop? Why care? Why risk turning someone else's nightmare into your own? The answer sat in his throat, heavy with 7 years of weight. Because I've been the one people didn't come for, he said. His voice carried something old, something that tasted like ash. And I'm tired of living in a place where that's normal. He didn't tell her about Sarah yet. Didn't tell her about the winter night when his sister came to his door with bruises blooming on her throat and fear making her voice small. Didn't tell her how he'd been tired, how he'd just buried his wife 3 months prior, how he'd told Sarah to go home and keep the peace until morning, how morning came and Sarah didn't. That story could wait. Right now, there was only the simple math of not being the man who rode past. Ethan lifted Claire again, practiced and careful. One arm under her knees, the other supporting her back, keeping his forearm position, so it took pressure off her ribs instead of adding to it. She was lighter than he expected, or maybe pain had made her seem heavier at first. Either way, he carried her to his horse like she was made of something breakable. The buckskin mare nickered softly, sensing distress the way horses do. Ethan spoke to her quiet and low, settling her with words that didn't matter except in tone. Then came the tricky part, getting Claire up into the saddle without making her pain worse. It took time. It took patience. It took 3 false starts where Claire's body simply refused to cooperate. But eventually she was sitting sideways in the saddle, both legs hanging down one side because sitting astride would have pulled at injuries she couldn't afford to aggravate. Ethan mounted behind her, his body a solid wall at her back. She stiffened at the contact and he felt it immediately. Felt the way her spine went rigid. Felt the quick intake of breath that had nothing to do with physical pain and everything to do with proximity. I'm right here, he said quietly. You're safe as I can make you. It wasn't much of a promise, but it was honest. They rode toward Dodge City with the sun high and getting higher and the prairie loud with grasshoppers and judgment. The afternoon heat shimmered up from the earth, turning the distant town into something wavering and uncertain. Claire kept her eyes on that horizon like she was afraid the moment she looked back, she'd see the posts again. See the rope. See proof that this rescue might dissolve into dream and leave her right back where she started. Ethan felt her breathing against his arm and matched the horse's pace to it. He didn't talk much because there are moments when talking feels like stealing air from someone who needs it more than you do. Still, after about a mile, she spoke, her voice small and bitter and edged with the kind of exhausted honesty that comes when you have got nothing left to lose. You shouldn't have stopped. Ethan kept his gaze forward, scanning the road ahead for trouble that might not announce itself. I already did. They'll come for you now, she said. Her head tilted slightly and he could see her profile, the set of her jaw. The way she was trying to warn him even while she needed him. They'll make you regret it. Let them. Claire let out a shaky breath that sounded like it wanted to become a laugh, but didn't know how anymore. You don't understand, she said. In Dodge City, pain is legal if it's done by the right hands. Ethan's jaw flexed, the muscle there jumping once hard. Then we put the wrong hands at daylight, he said. The words hung between them, both promise and threat. Claire fell silent after that, and Ethan let the quiet settle. But his mind was working, turning over what he knew about Dodge City's power structure, about men who used law like a weapon and called it order. He knew Sheriff Morgan, who'd held the position for 8 years through a combination of looking the other way at the right times and being mean enough that nobody wanted to challenge him. He knew the deputy, a younger man named Walker, who had good intentions buried under bad orders. He knew the businessmen who really ran things, the ones who sat in church on Sunday and counted money from crooked land deals on Monday. And he knew one name that sat above all the others like a snake coiled on a throne. Warren Hayes, landowner, businessman. The kind of man who'd smile at you while signing the paper that took your farm. The kind who never got his own hands dirty, but always had clean shirts willing to do the digging for him. If Claire Bennett had been put on those posts, Warren Hayes had ordered it. Ethan would have bet his ranch on that. As the town drew closer, he felt Claire's body tighten. every muscle going taut, the very sight of Dodge City reaching out to grab her even from a mile away. The town didn't look like a villain. That was always the trick. It looked like a place where men bought flour and children chased dogs and church bells pretended the world was decent. Two-story buildings, wide main street, hitching posts with patient horses. From a distance, you could almost mistake it for somewhere safe. But the porch sitters were already turning their heads, watching. The street began to quiet in that particular way. It quiets when everyone knows something ugly has happened and nobody wants to be the one to say it out loud. Ethan rode straight down Main Street, not hurrying, not hiding. Let them see. Let them mark his face. Let them understand that whatever they'd tried to accomplish with those posts, it hadn't worked the way they planned. He headed for the office of Dr. Samuel Porter because Porter had a reputation. Not for courage. Porter wasn't brave, but Porter was honest in the ways that mattered. He could be bribed to keep his mouth shut, but he couldn't be bribed to lie with his hands. He'd treat what needed treating. That mattered more than comfort right now. The doctor's office sat on a side street, a small building that smelled of carbolic and boiled cloth even from outside. Ethan dismounted first, then helped Claire down with the same care he'd used getting her up. Her legs wobbled, but she locked her knees and stayed upright through what looked like pure stubbornness. The door opened before Ethan could knock. Dr. Samuel Porter stood there, 57 years old and looking older. Gray hair, tired eyes, the kind of weariness that comes from patching up too many sins and still waking up in the same town. Porter's eyes flicked over Claire's condition. The torn dress, the rope burns, the way she held her left side, the bruise on her shoulder. His mouth tightened into a thin line, but he didn't ask questions. Not yet. He just stepped aside. Bring her in. Ethan guided Claire through the door, and the cool dimness of the office felt like mercy after the brutal sun. Porter gestured to an examination table covered with clean white cloth. Claire sat down slowly, each movement calculated to minimize pain. Porter washed his hands at a basin in the corner, methodical and thorough. When he turned back, he had his doctor face on. Professional, detached. But Ethan could see something else underneath, something that looked like shame. Who did this? Porter asked quietly. Claire's eyes went to Ethan, asking permission. Or maybe asking for protection from having to say it herself. Tell him if you want, Ethan said, or don't. Claire swallowed, looked down at her hands, then back up at Porter with something defiant struggling to life beneath all that pain. Warren Hayes, she whispered. Porter's hand paused, just a fraction of a second, just long enough for Ethan to see the fear flicker across the doctor's face. Then Porter nodded once and returned to his examination. But as he worked testing Claire's shoulder, checking her ribs, cleaning the rope burns, with gentle hands, Ethan noticed something, the way Porter's eyes kept flicking to a cabinet in the corner. A locked cabinet, the kind you keep things in that aren't meant for public viewing. He filed that away too. Another piece of a puzzle he was only beginning to see the edges of. Outside, boots crossed wood. Heavy. Purposeful. The door swung open without a knock, and Deputy Walker stepped in. Badge bright, eyes empty of everything except duty to the wrong people. And behind him, like he'd been waiting for his cue, came Warren Hayes himself. Ethan had seen the man before. Around town, at the stockyard, always clean, always smiling, always surrounded by an invisible wall that kept him separate from consequence. He wore a vest today, pressed and perfect. His boots had a shine that spoke of servants. His hands were soft, the kind of soft that came from never doing real work. But it was his eyes that told the truth. Pale blue, cold. The eyes of a man who'd looked at another human being and seen only an obstacle or a tool. Warren looked at Claire sitting on the examination table and sighed. Actually sighed, like he'd found a stray dog in his parlor. There you are, Warren said, his voice soft. Pleased. We've been worried. Claire's body went tight as wire. Ethan felt it from 6 feet away. Felt the terror slam back into her like a physical blow. Warren's gaze slid to Ethan, amused and assessing all at once. Mr. Cole, he said, like they were old friends, like they'd shared drinks instead of mutual contempt. You've made yourself part of a private matter. Ethan didn't move, didn't let his hand drift toward the knife at his belt. He just stood there, solid and immovable as the post Claire had been tied to. You put her on post like a carcass, Ethan said. his voice quiet as a threat. That's not private, that's a message. Warren's smile widened, not reaching his eyes, never reaching his eyes. Messages are sometimes necessary, he said, like he was explaining basic arithmetic to a slow child. People forget their place. Claire's voice cracked across the room, surprising everyone, including herself. I don't belong to you. Warren's eyes flicked to her. Just for a second, the way you'd look at a chair that suddenly spoke. Then he looked back at Ethan, tone still courteous, still reasonable. The sheriff has papers, Warren said. Order of detainment. She's been a disturbance. Speaking out of turn, Claire whispered something so quiet Ethan almost missed it. Speaking. Warren lifted one shoulder. Same thing, really, in a town trying to stay orderly. Deputy Walker cleared his throat. The sound of a man who knew he was doing wrong and had run out of ways to justify it to himself, Mr. Cole Walker said. You need to step aside. Ethan didn't move. He looked at Claire instead, saw her shaking, saw her trying to hold herself together on pure will and fading fast, saw the way Warren looked at her like property that had wandered off and needed corralling. And Ethan made the decision that would shake Dodge City harder than a gunshot in church. He stepped forward, not toward the door, toward Claire. He reached for the blanket Porter kept on the examination table and pulled it up around her shoulders with a gentleness that made the room suddenly ashamed of itself. She's coming with me, Ethan said. The words fell into silence like stones into still water, ripples of consequence spreading out from them in ways none of them could see yet. Warren's smile disappeared, not into rage, into something worse. Calculation. You don't get to decide that, Warren said. Ethan's voice stayed even, stayed quiet, stayed absolutely certain. Then arrest me. That moment right there was the unthinkable. Not the rope cutting, not even the defiance. The unthinkable was refusing to play the town's favorite game, the one where everyone pretends they don't see it, so they don't have to be responsible for it. Warren leaned in, close enough that only Ethan could hear him, close enough that Ethan could smell the pomade in his hair and the expensive tobacco on his breath. You can walk away, Warren murmured. Go back to your quiet little ranch. Nobody has to remember you were ever here. Ethan's eyes didn't leave Warren's face, didn't blink, didn't flinch. That's the problem, he said softly. Everybody forgets. The door swung open again, hard enough that it banged against the wall, and the room changed shape airily. A man stepped in wearing travel dust and a coat cut better than most men in Dodge City could afford. His posture was straight in a way that didn't come from pride. It came from marching, from standing at attention in front of men who could end your career with a word. He carried authority without waving it around, and when he spoke, his voice made even Warren's bought deputy hesitate. Put your hands down, the man said. All of you, Warren blinked, his composure cracking just slightly. And who? The man held up a badge. Federal, the kind that meant jurisdiction didn't stop at county lines. U.S. Marshal Thomas Garrett, he said. And I've been looking for the reason Dodge City keeps losing cattle on paper but never in the pasture. The air went still. Because papers mattered more than bruises in towns like this. Papers were what made wickedness look lawful. Papers were what let men like Warren sleep sound at night. Marshal Garrett's eyes swept the room, took in Claire's condition, the rope marks, the torn dress, the way she held herself. Then his gaze settled on Warren Hayes with the kind of attention a hawk gives a rabbit. And Ethan Cole, standing there with his hand on Claire's shoulder, realized something that felt almost like hope. Maybe this time daylight would win. Marshal Thomas Garrett stood in the doorway like a wall made of federal law and personal conviction. 43 years old, clean-shaven, gray eyes that had seen enough corruption to recognize it on sight. He wore his authority the way some men wore their Sunday clothes, with the ease of long practice and the weight of knowing what it carried. Warren Hayes recovered first, that smile crawling back onto his face like a snake returning to shade. Marshal Warren said smoothly, his voice all honey and reason. This is simply a misunderstanding, a local matter that doesn't require federal intervention. Garrett's gaze didn't waver, didn't soften. He looked at Warren the way a judge looks at evidence. A woman tied to posts on public land, Garrett said, his tone mild, which somehow made it sharper. That's not a misunderstanding, Mr. Hayes. That's a statement. Warren gave a careful laugh, the kind designed to make other men feel foolish for taking things too seriously. She's a troublemaker, Warren said. Making accusations, stirring up decent folk with wild stories about land records and boundary disputes. We were simply maintaining order. Garrett's eyes cut to Claire, really looked at her for the first time, took in the rope burns at her wrists already darkening into bruises that would last weeks. The way she held her left side like breathing cost extra. The tremor in her hands that had nothing to do with cold. The particular emptiness in her eyes that comes from being treated like a lesson instead of a person. Then his gaze moved back to Warren. Troublemakers usually write things down, Garrett said. And I hear Miss Bennett here has been writing quite a bit. County maps, brand ledgers, names. Warren's smile flickered. Just for a heartbeat. Just long enough for everyone in the room to see the crack in his composure. Claire stared at Garrett like she couldn't decide if he was real or if pain had conjured him from desperate hope. Her voice came out small, testing. How did you know my name? Garrett pulled a folded paper from inside his coat, smoothed it open with practiced hands. 3 weeks ago, a letter arrived at the federal courthouse in Topeka, he said. Detailed allegations of land fraud, cattle theft, and forgery spanning a decade. Signed by a Miss C. Bennett of Dodge City, Kansas. Said letter requested investigation into irregularities in county records and specifically named Warren Hayes as the primary suspect. The room went silent in a way that had texture. You could almost touch it. Warren's face went carefully blank. Not angry, not defensive, just empty. The mask he wore when thinking hard about next moves. Deputy Walker shifted his weight from one foot to the other, and Ethan could see the man's internal struggle playing out across his features. The badge on his chest suddenly looking heavier than it had 5 minutes ago. Dr. Porter had gone very still at his examination table, hands frozen in the act of bandaging Claire's wrists. His eyes flicked to that locked cabinet again, just for a second, and Ethan caught it. Whatever was in there mattered enough that Porter was afraid. Claire's breathing had changed, gotten faster. Her hand moved toward her stomach again in that protective gesture, then stopped halfway as if she'd caught herself. I sent that letter 2 months ago, she said quietly. I thought it never arrived. Garrett folded the paper back into his coat. It arrived, he said. I've been in Kansas 3 weeks now, checking records, following trails, and every trail leads back here, to Dodge City, to county lines that shift on paper but not on the ground, to deeds signed by men who've been dead for years, to cattle that disappear from one ranch and reappear on another with fresh brands. He paused. Let the weight of those words settle. To people who ask questions and then stop asking them very suddenly. That last part hung in the air like smoke. Everyone in the room knew what it meant. The people who'd stopped asking questions hadn't stopped because they'd gotten answers. Warren's jaw tightened. Just a fraction. But Ethan saw it. The first real crack in the man's armor. Marshal Warren said, his voice still controlled but with an edge now. You don't have jurisdiction over local law enforcement matters. This woman was detained on the authority of Sheriff Morgan for disturbing the peace and making false accusations. Garrett's expression didn't change. I have jurisdiction over theft that crosses county lines, he said. I have jurisdiction over fraud involving federal land grants. I have jurisdiction over mail fraud since those forged deeds were filed through postal services. And I have jurisdiction over any man who thinks rope serves as legal process. Warren opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I want to see these papers you're talking about, he said, these so-called evidence of wrongdoing, because I think you'll find that everything in Dodge City is perfectly legal and properly documented. Garrett smiled then. It wasn't a pleasant smile. I'm sure you do think that, Mr. Hayes, which is why I'll be examining every deed, every survey, every brand registration filed in this county for the past 15 years, starting tomorrow morning. He turned to Deputy Walker. You, step outside now. Walker hesitated, looked at Warren, looked at Garrett. The federal badge won. Walker mumbled something that might have been yes, sir, and left the office, the door closing behind him with a sound like finality. Warren watched him go, and something cold flickered across his face, the look of a man making calculations about loyalty and liability. Garrett moved closer to Claire, not crowding her, just near enough to speak in a lower voice. Miss Bennett, he said, did you write that letter? Claire lifted her chin. Despite the pain, despite the fear, despite everything. Yes, she said, her voice steadier now. finding strength in the presence of someone who might actually listen. I wrote down where the boundary lines moved. I wrote down who signed what. I wrote down which deputy always looked the other way when cattle crossed the river at night. I wrote down the names of families who lost their land and the dates Warren Hayes filed new deeds. She swallowed, glanced at Warren, then back to Garrett, and I wrote down the names of 6 people who protested and then disappeared. The number landed like a physical blow. 6, not disputes, not disagreements, disappeared. Warren's face went pale around the eyes, the polite mask starting to slip in earnest now. "That's slander," he said, his voice sharp. "Those are wild accusations from a hysterical woman who doesn't understand how land law works." Garrett ignored him entirely, kept his attention on Claire. "Where's this evidence now?" Garrett asked. Claire's eyes flicked to Dr. Porter, just for a second, but it was enough. Porter went rigid, his hands gripping the edge of the examination table hard enough that his knuckles showed white. Garrett noticed. Of course he noticed. "That was his job," Dr. Porter, Garrett said quietly. "Is there something you'd like to tell me?" The silence stretched. Porter looked at Claire, at Warren, at Ethan, at the floor, his whole body a study in the war between fear and conscience. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "3 months ago, Claire came to see me. Not as a patient. She asked if I could keep something safe, something important." Warren took a step forward, fast enough that Ethan moved too, putting himself between Warren and the doctor without even thinking about it. "What did you give him?" Warren demanded, his careful mask shattering now. "What lies did you put in writing?" Claire's voice cut across his. "The truth," she said. "Every piece of evidence I could find over 18 months of investigation. Maps showing the original county boundaries compared to current filed boundaries. Lists of brand registrations that don't match the cattle actually grazing the land. Copies of deeds with signatures that forensic analysis would prove were forged. And witness statements." Her eyes locked onto Warren's. "Including one from a ranch hand who saw you shoot Miguel Reyes in 1883 and bury him in your south pasture." The room went dead silent. Warren's face transformed, all pretense evaporating. What remained was cold and calculating and very, very dangerous. "You have no proof," he said flatly. Claire smiled. It was a terrible smile. The smile of someone who'd been pushed past breaking and found something hard on the other side. "I have a tin box," she said, "hidden where you'll never find it, full of every crime you've committed for the past decade. And when the marshal here opens it, every clean shirt in this town is going to have to choose whether they want to keep pretending they didn't know." Warren stared at her, really stared, like he was seeing her for the first time. Seeing past the schoolteacher facade to the woman who'd been building a case against him piece by piece while he thought her powerless. Where Warren asked, his voice soft, deadly, Garrett stepped between them. "That's enough," he said. "Mr. Hayes, you are going to leave this office now. I'll be speaking with Sheriff Morgan, and you can expect a formal interview tomorrow morning. Do not attempt to leave town." Warren's eyes stayed on Claire for another beat. Then he turned without a word and walked out, Deputy Walker following like a shadow. The door closed. The air in the room seemed to expand. Dr. Porter let out a breath he'd been holding and sat down heavily on his stool. His hands were shaking. "I've been so afraid," he said. "To no one in particular. Every day for 3 months I've been afraid." Ethan found his voice. "Where is it?" he asked Claire. The tin box. Claire looked at him. "At Garrett, making a decision. Schoolhouse," she said, "under the floorboard by the stove. I figured Warren would never look in a place where children learn to read." Garrett nodded. "I'll retrieve it tonight, with witnesses. We'll document everything properly." He looked at Ethan then, really looked at him. "You cut her down," Garrett said. It wasn't a question. Ethan nodded. Garrett's expression softened just slightly. "You listened when she said it hurt," Garrett continued. "You took care." Ethan didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Garrett turned to Claire. "You need somewhere safe to stay, somewhere outside town jurisdiction until we can build a proper case. The courthouse has rooms, but they're not secure. Warren owns too many people." Ethan spoke before he could talk himself out of it. "She comes to my ranch." Everyone looked at him. "My place is 5 miles west," Ethan continued. "Outside town limits, defensible. Warren's people won't come at it directly, not with a federal marshal watching." Garrett studied him. "You understand what you're offering. If Hayes wants her silenced, your ranch becomes a target. Ethan's jaw set. Then I guess he'll have to go through me. Garrett held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. All right, take her, keep her safe. I'll come out tomorrow with whatever we find at the schoolhouse. He paused. And Mr. Cole, don't do anything heroic. Heroic men get themselves killed. Ethan's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Out here, heroic just means in the way. They left as the sun began its descent toward evening. Claire on Ethan's horse, Ethan mounted behind her, the town watching through windows and doorways, with the kind of attention that felt like accusation. The prairie opened before them, vast and amber in the slanting light. Claire kept her spine straight, despite the pain, like she refused to let Dodge City see her broken even from a distance. They rode in silence for the first mile. The only sounds were the steady rhythm of hooves, the wind through grass, and the occasional call of birds settling in for night. Then Claire spoke. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice quiet but clear. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, watching the horizon, feeling the weight of that question in his chest. I had a sister, he said finally. Sarah. She married young, married a man everyone said was respectable. Good family. Good prospects. He paused. The words came hard. About 7 years back, she started showing up with bruises. Always had explanations. Fell. Walked into a door. Clumsy, she'd say. But I knew. The horse walked on. The sun sank lower. One night in winter, she came to my door. Ethan continued. It was cold. So cold you could see your breath freeze. She was shaking, had marks on her throat where he'd grabbed her. She asked if she could stay the night, asked if I could help her figure out what to do. His voice went rough. I was tired. My wife had died 3 months before. I was drowning in my own grief. I told Sarah to go home, told her to keep the peace until morning, and we'd talk about it then when everyone was calmer. Claire turned her head slightly, listening. She went home, Ethan said, and the next morning they found her at the bottom of a ravine about a mile from her house. Her husband said she'd been upset, hysterical, ran out into the night and must have fallen in the dark. The silence that followed was full of understanding. The town believed him. Ethan finished. Sheriff didn't even investigate properly. Her husband left town a month later. Never faced a single question. And I learned that sometimes the worst thing you can do to someone isn't violence, it's looking away. Claire's hand moved to cover his where it rested on the saddle horn. Just for a moment, just long enough. I'm sorry, she whispered. Me too, Ethan said. They rode the rest of the way in a silence that felt less empty than before. Ethan's ranch appeared as the sun touched the horizon, painting everything gold and crimson. A small cabin, a barn, corrals with a few horses. Nothing fancy, but clean, maintained. The kind of place a man builds when he needs work to keep the ghosts at bay. As they approached, a figure emerged from the barn. A woman older with gray hair, pulled back severe, and a face that had seen enough of life to have opinions about it. Ethan reined in surprised. Mrs. Whitmore. Martha Whitmore, 52 years old and owner of Dodge City's boarding house, walked toward them with a basket over one arm. Her eyes went to Claire and softened in a way that made Claire's throat tight. I heard what they did, Martha said without preamble. Heard you cut her down. Figured she'd need some things. She held up the basket. Ethan could see clean clothes. Food. Bandages. How did you know we'd be here? Ethan asked. Martha gave him a look that said she didn't suffer foolish questions. Where else would you take her? Town's not safe. Your place is the only spot Warren can't reach easy. She turned to Claire. I brought you a dress, she said, and some things for comfort. Claire's eyes filled. She tried to speak and couldn't. Martha stepped closer, lowered her voice so only Claire and Ethan could hear. There are others, she said, women in town who know what happened to you, who are sick of watching Warren Hayes run roughshod over anyone who questions him. We've been too afraid to speak. But maybe it's time we stop being afraid. She looked at Ethan. You need help out here, you send word. There are more folks willing to stand up than Warren thinks. Then Martha turned and walked back toward the road where her wagon waited, leaving the basket on the porch. Ethan helped Claire down from the horse. She swayed on her feet, exhaustion and pain, finally catching up now that the immediate danger had passed. Inside, Ethan lit a lamp. The cabin was sparse but clean. A bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, a stove. shelves with supplies, the kind of space that spoke of solitary living. He brought water, bread, some dried meat. Claire ate like someone who'd forgotten what hunger felt like until food was in front of her. When she finished, she sat very still, looking around the small space. The door, she said quietly. Can it stay open? Ethan understood immediately. Closed spaces, trapped, the posts. It stays however you need it, he said. He pushed the door wide. Evening air flowed in, carrying the smell of prairie grass and horses in open sky. Claire's shoulders dropped half an inch. Thank you, she whispered. Ethan started to move away to give her space, but her voice stopped him. There's something you should know. He turned back. Claire's hand went to her stomach, the gesture deliberate this time. Not hiding, I'm 4 months pregnant, she said. The words coming out in a rush like she'd been holding them behind a dam. From before. From my marriage before I came to Dodge City. Ethan went very still. My husband died, Claire continued. Accident. Real accident, not the kind Warren arranges. I came here to start over. Thought a small town would be safer for raising a child alone. I was going to tell people I was widowed, which is true, and just make a life, her voice shook. But then I started noticing the land records didn't match, and I couldn't just ignore it. My father lost his farm to Warren Hayes 10 years ago, died 6 months later. The deed said he sold it willingly, but I remember my father fighting it. I remember Warren coming to the house with papers. I remember my father's face. She looked up at Ethan, the land I was going to buy for my child. The small plot outside town where I was going to build a house. It was my father's land. The land Warren stole. Understanding crashed over Ethan like cold water. That's why you investigated, he said. Not just justice, inheritance. Claire nodded. My child deserves that land. It's their birthright. But more than that, I couldn't let another generation grow up thinking theft is legal if you have the right papers. She took a shaky breath. Warren knows about the baby now. He saw. When you carried me, he knows that if I have this child, if I prove the land was stolen, my child inherits everything Warren built his empire on. The stakes suddenly made terrible sense. That's why the post, Ethan said, not just punishment, warning. Claire's eyes were fierce despite the tears. He wanted me to lose the baby, wanted the stress, the pain, the exposure to kill it. Then the problem goes away. Ethan felt rage rise in his chest, cold and controlled. The kind of anger that doesn't make you stupid. That's not going to happen, he said. Claire searched his face. Why would you protect us? You don't know me, don't owe me anything. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. The lamplight made shadows dance on the walls. I told you about Sarah, he said, but I didn't tell you all of it. He stared at his hands that had failed once. When they found her body, she was 3 months pregnant. I didn't know, she hadn't told anyone yet, but the doctor who examined her body told me after. Said the fall killed both of them. His voice went rough as gravel. So when I see you pregnant and in danger asking for help, I can't walk away from that. Won't walk away. Not again. Claire's tears spilled over then. Not from pain, from the weight of being seen, being believed, being worth protecting. They sat in silence as night deepened outside. The prairie went quiet except for the sounds that belonged there. Wind, crickets, the distant call of an owl. Finally, Ethan stood. You take the bed, he said. I'll sleep out here by the stove. Claire started to protest, but he held up a hand. Not up for discussion. You need rest, real rest. And you need to know you're safe while you get it. He handed her the clean dress Martha had brought. I'll be right here. Anything you need, anything you hear that scares you, you call out. Understand? Claire nodded, took the dress, hesitated. Ethan, she said, his name in her mouth for the first time. Yeah, thank you for listening when I said it hurt. Most men wouldn't have. Ethan's jaw worked. Most men should, he said simply. Claire went to the bed. Ethan heard her moving behind the partition, changing clothes, settling under the blanket. After a while, her breathing evened out. Not quite sleep, but rest at least. Ethan sat at the table, rifle across his knees. Not pointed, not threatening, just present. Outside, the moon rose full and bright, turning the prairie silver. Peaceful if you didn't know better. But Ethan knew better. Knew that men like Warren Hayes didn't let go of power easily. knew that come morning there would be consequences for everything that happened today. He'd cut Claire down. He'd defied Warren in front of witnesses. He'd brought her here under his protection. Those weren't small things. Those were declarations. And declarations always came with prices. Ethan checked his rifle, made sure his pistol was loaded, counted the rounds he had stored, did the mental math of how many men Warren could muster versus how many bullets Ethan had. The math didn't work in his favor, but math had never stopped him before. Around midnight, Claire stirred, spoke from the darkness. "Ethan, I'm here. Do you think Garrett will really help, or is he just another man with a badge who'll disappear when Warren makes it worth his while?" Ethan thought about that, about the way Garrett had looked at Claire's rope burns, about the steel in his voice when he told Warren to leave. "I think he's the real thing," Ethan said. "I think he's seen enough corruption to be sick of it, but even good men can only do what the law allows. And if the law isn't enough, then we make do with what else we've got." Silence. Then Claire's voice again, smaller. "I'm scared." Ethan didn't lie to her, didn't offer false comfort. "You should be," he said. "Warren's dangerous. He's got money and power and men who'll do what he says without asking questions. This isn't over. Not by a long shot." He paused. "But you're not alone anymore. That counts for something." "It does," Claire whispered. "It really does." The night deepened. Stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. And somewhere in Dodge City, Warren Hayes sat in his fine house with his expensive whiskey-making plans. Plans that involved fire. Plans that involved making problems disappear. Plans that would come to fruition tomorrow night. But for now, in a small ranch house on the Kansas prairie, two broken people found something that felt almost like safety. A woman who'd been treated like property, learning that protection didn't have to come with conditions. A man who'd failed once, learning that second chances sometimes arrived wearing someone else's face. And between them, the fragile beginning of something that might outlast the violence coming for them, if they survived long enough to let it grow. The first sign of trouble came at 2 in the morning when the horses in the corral started moving wrong. Not spooked, not nervous, just alert in the way animals get when something predatory enters their territory. Ethan had been dozing in the chair by the table rifle across his lap. Not real sleep. The kind of half-conscious waiting that comes from knowing danger is a question of when, not if. His eyes opened the moment the first horse snorted. He stood slowly, joints protesting. 50 years of hard work had left their mark on his body, but they'd also taught him how to move quiet when it mattered. He crossed to the open door, keeping to the shadows, and looked out into the moonlit yard. The prairie stretched silver and black under a full moon. Beautiful if you had the luxury of appreciating it. Ethan didn't. His eyes were scanning the darkness for movement, for shapes that didn't belong, for the telltale signs of men trying to be invisible. There, about 200 yards out, moving along the low ridge that marked the eastern boundary of his property. Riders, coming slow, using the natural dips in the land to hide their approach from the direct line of sight. Ethan counted silently. 1, 2, 3 visible. But the way they were spaced suggested more behind them, staying low. His stomach tightened. This wasn't a warning visit. This was a raid. Behind him, he heard Claire stir in the bed. Her voice came soft and frightened from the darkness. "Ethan." He didn't turn around, kept watching the approaching riders. "Get up," he said quietly. "Get dressed. We need to move." He heard her rise, heard the rustle of fabric as she pulled on the dress Martha had brought. Then her footsteps, careful and pained, as she came to stand near him. "How many?" she asked. "6, he said. "Maybe more." Claire's breath caught. Her hand went to her stomach in that protective gesture that was becoming familiar. "Warren sent them." It wasn't a question, but Ethan answered anyway. "Warren's with them." That got her attention. She looked at him sharply. "He never comes himself. He always sends others." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's how I know he's serious this time. You're not just an inconvenience anymore. You're a threat he can't delegate." He turned from the door and moved to the bed, kneeling down. There was a wooden panel beneath it, flush with the floor. He pried it up, revealing a narrow space below. A storm cellar of sorts. Small, dark, barely big enough for one person. "No," Claire said immediately, her voice sharp with fear. "I'm not hiding while you fight." "You're not hiding," Ethan said. He looked up at her and his eyes were steady. "You're surviving. There's a difference. I can help. I can shoot." Ethan stood, placed his hands on her shoulders, gentle but firm. "You're 4 months pregnant, and you spent most of yesterday tied to posts," he said. "Your body needs rest, not gunfight. And I need to know you're safe so I can focus on what's coming." Claire's eyes filled with frustrated tears. "I can't leave you alone." "You're not leaving me," Ethan said. "You're trusting me. There's a difference there, too." He guided her toward the opening. She resisted at first, then let him help her down. The space was cramped and smelled of earth, but it was solid, safe. "You don't come up until I say your name," Ethan said. "Not for gunfire, not for shouting, not unless you hear my voice calling for Claire. Understand?" She nodded, even though her whole body was shaking. "What if you don't come back?" The question hung between them like smoke. "Then you wait until morning," Ethan said. "Until you're sure they're gone. Then you run. You find Marshall Garrett. You tell him everything, and you make sure that baby gets born safe. You hear me?" Claire grabbed his hand, held it tight. "Don't die," she whispered. "Please don't die." Ethan squeezed back, then pulled away and lowered the panel into place. He shifted the rug over it, making the floor look undisturbed. Then he grabbed his rifle, checked the rounds one more time, and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cool against his face. The moon painted everything in shades of silver and shadow. And the riders were closer now, close enough that he could make out individual shapes, close enough to see that one of them rode differently than the others. Sat his horse with the kind of casual arrogance that spoke of a man who'd never had to do his own dirty work. Warren Hayes coming to clean up his own mess for once. The riders reached the fence line and stopped. For a long moment, nobody moved. Just 6 men on horses staring at one man standing on a porch with a rifle. The mathematics of violence working themselves out in silence. Then one of the riders dismounted, moved forward with a distinctive hitch in his step, a limp that spoke of old injury poorly healed. Jack Drummond, Warren's right hand, the man who did the things Warren's clean shirts couldn't afford to be seen doing. Ethan had seen Jack around town, knew him by reputation. Enforcer, collector. The kind of man who smiled when he hurt people and called it just doing his job. But there was something else about Jack, too. Something in his eyes that suggested he hadn't always been this way. That somewhere along the line, circumstances had ground him down into something he maybe hadn't meant to become. Jack walked forward until he was about 30 feet from the porch. Far enough to be polite, close enough to be threatening. "Evening call," Jack called out. His voice carried across the yard, easy, pleasant even, like they were neighbors discussing weather. "We're looking for a woman. She's gone missing. Thought maybe you'd seen her." Ethan didn't move, didn't raise the rifle, just kept it resting against his shoulder barrel, pointed at the sky, but ready to come down fast if needed. "You're on my land," Ethan said, his voice flat, empty of everything except certainty. "State your business plain." Jack's smile widened, not reaching his eyes. "Business is simple," he said. "The woman you took from town this afternoon. Miss Bennett, she's wanted for questioning. Sheriff has papers. We're here to bring her back." Ethan's eyes flicked past Jack to the other riders. To Warren sitting his horse in the shadows like a man who thought darkness made him invisible. "If the sheriff wants her, the sheriff can come get her," Ethan said. "In daylight, with proper warrants, not at 2 in the morning with hired guns." Jack took another step forward, his hand drifting casual like toward the pistol at his hip. "Now, Cole, don't make this difficult. We're doing you a favor here. Hand her over and you go back to being nobody. Keep her and you become a problem. And problems out here tend to solve themselves permanent like." Ethan's voice stayed level. "I ain't invisible," he said. "I'm just quiet. There's a difference, Abdisan." Jack's smile tightened at the edges. "Quiet men live longer." "Not tonight," Ethan replied. The words fell into silence, the temperature of the encounter shifting from false courtesy to naked threat. Behind Jack, one of the other riders shifted in his saddle, impatient, young probably, the kind who thought violence was exciting instead of ugly. His hand was already on his gun, just waiting for permission. Jack glanced back at that rider. Some silent communication passing between them. Then he looked at Warren, still saddling his horse like royalty, observing peasants. Warren nodded once. Small, barely visible, but enough. Jack's expression changed, the pretense dropping away like a shed skin. You cut her down this afternoon, he said, his voice different now, harder. That wasn't your place, Cole. Ethan's jaw set. Tying her up wasn't yours. Jack stepped closer, boots crunching on dry earth. You don't know what she did, don't know the trouble she's caused. I know what rope means, Ethan said. Another rider dismounted behind Jack, started angling wide, moving toward the side of the cabin, trying to get around to the window, to create a crossfire or find another entrance. Ethan's muscles tightened. His thumb moved to rest on the rifle's hammer. Still not threatening, still not pointed at anyone, but ready. He shifted his position, just one step, just enough to keep himself between that flanking rider and the cabin door. The message clear. You come at this house, you come through me first. Jack saw it and smiled like he'd been hoping for exactly that response. There it is, he said softly. That's the problem with you, Cole. You started caring. Caring makes a man stupid, makes him throw away a safe life for someone who ain't even his. Ethan's voice dropped lower, the kind of quiet that's more dangerous than shouting. Get off my land. Jack's hand drifted closer to his holster, not grabbing, not drawing, just hovering. A threat that wanted to look casual, or what Ethan looked him dead in the eye. Saw something there he recognized. The look of a man who'd spent so long following orders that he'd forgotten how to choose for himself. A man who'd become a tool and called it employment. Or you'll learn what it feels like when somebody finally says no. The silence stretched. Moonlight made everything look clean, and that almost made it crueler. 6 armed men against 1. Mathematics that didn't leave room for heroics. The flanking rider was moving again, getting closer to the cabin side wall, getting ready to make his move, and Jack took one more step forward, testing, pushing the line. Ethan made his decision. He stepped back off the porch, not retreating, redirecting, moving sideways toward the corral gate, towards open ground, towards space where bullets wouldn't punch through cabin walls to find the woman hiding beneath the floor. You want me, Ethan said, his voice carrying across the yard. Come take me. Jack's grin widened, like this was exactly what he'd been waiting for. Like Ethan had just fallen into a trap instead of setting one. That's more like it. And Ethan fired, not at Jack, not at any of the men. He fired into the dirt near Jack's boots, the shot kicking up a spray of earth that made Jack jump back, cursing. The sound cracked across the prairie like judgment. The horses spooked. The riders swore and drew their weapons. And Ethan didn't wait to trade bullets standing still. He swung up onto his own horse in one practice motion, the rifle still in his hand, and he rode. Rode hard into the pasture, pulling the fight away from the cabin, away from the floorboard that hid Claire's terrified breathing. Behind him, gunshots split the night. Wild, angry, meant more to scare than to hit, at least at first. The riders followed exactly as he'd hoped, hooves thundering, night wind tearing at his hat. The chase on. Ethan knew this land, every gopher hole, every wash where the creek cut through in spring, every place where the ground looked solid but would catch a horse's hoof if you didn't know to avoid it. He led them toward the low draw that split his property like a scar, the earth falling away sudden into a depression, maybe 8 feet deep. Hard to see in daylight, nearly invisible at night. At the last second, Ethan veered, his horse jumping the narrow part where the banks were lowest. Behind him, the lead rider, that young impatient one, came on too fast, too eager. His horse hit the soft edge where the bank crumbled and nearly went down. The animal caught itself scrambling, but the rider's momentum was broken. He fell behind, shouting frustration into the dark. Ethan used the moment to widen the distance, put another 50 yards between himself and the pursuit. Then he angled toward the line of cottonwood trees that marked where the creek ran, where South Bend was, where if Garrett had been smart, there'd be federal deputies waiting. The chase carried them across open prairie like a storm. Ethan could hear the riders behind him breathing hard, could feel their frustration rising, could sense them starting to realize they weren't hunting a scared schoolteacher. They were chasing a rancher who knew every inch of the ground beneath their horse's hooves. Jack Drummond's voice carried over the thunder of hooves. Cole, you can't win this. Give her up and we'll let you live. Ethan didn't answer, didn't waste breath on words. The land answered for him with its dips and ridges and honest distance. As the cottonwoods grew closer, Ethan saw what he'd been praying for. Lantern light, dim, steady, controlled. Not the wild swing of men riding, but the deliberate placement of men waiting. Garrett had understood, had set his trap exactly where Ethan had hoped. Ethan angled straight for those lights, and the riders behind him, blinded by anger and moonlight, followed without thinking. Followed without seeing the trap closing around them like a fist. Then Marshal Garrett's voice cut through the night like iron through silk. "Stop right there, United States Marshal!" The lanterns flared brighter. Federal baites stepped out from the trees, rifles shouldered, spread wide enough to create a perimeter, close enough together that there was no gap to slip through. The riders hauled on their reins, horses skidding, snorting. Jack Drummond's mount nearly reared, and Jack fought it back down, cursing. Garrett stepped forward, calm as a man reading from a ledger. But the rifle in his hands never wavered. "Hands where I can see them," Garrett said. Jack's eyes darted around, looking for escape, looking for options. Finding neither, Warren Hayes sat his horse at the back of the group, and even in the lamplight, Ethan could see the rage twisting his features. All that careful composure gone, replaced by the naked fury of a man who'd never been told no before and didn't know how to process it. Jack hesitated, looking back at Warren for orders. "I said hands," Garrett repeated, quieter this time, and somehow worse. Slowly, with the reluctance of a man who knew his night had just ended badly, Jack raised his palms. The other riders followed suit because whatever loyalty they had wasn't worth federal prison. Garrett's men moved in fast and professional, disarming, patting down, checking for hidden weapons with the kind of thoroughness that came from experience. When they searched Jack, one of the deputies pulled a folded piece of paper from inside his vest, held it up for Garrett to see. "Marshal, you'll want to look at this." Garrett took the paper, unfolded it by lantern light. His expression barely changed, but his eyes did. They went colder, harder. The look of a man who'd just found the evidence he needed. He read aloud. "Jack retrieved Claire Bennett before dawn. Handle Cole if he interferes. I'll manage the marshal afterward. Signed W.H." Garrett looked up, his gaze finding Warren in the group. "W.H.," he said. "Would that be Warren Hayes?" Warren's face had gone pale, not with fear, with calculation. Already trying to figure out how to spin this, how to claim the note was forged or misunderstood or taken out of context. "That's not," Warren started. "It's your handwriting," Garrett interrupted, "on your personal stationery, with your signature, ordering the kidnapping of a federal witness and making threats against a federal officer." He paused. "Let that sink in." "That's helpful, Mr. Hayes, real helpful." Jack Drummond stood there, still mounted, and something changed in his face, the hard shell cracking. He looked at Warren with an expression that mixed betrayal and bitter recognition. "You were going to let me hang for this," Jack said, his voice flat. "Weren't you, all these years, all the dirty work, and you were just going to feed me to the marshal and walk away clean?" Warren said nothing, and that silence was answer enough. Jack's shoulders sagged. For just a moment, he looked less like a dangerous man and more like someone who'd spent too long being used and just now realized it. Garrett gestured to his deputies. "All of them. Cuff them. We're taking them in." He looked at Ethan. "You all right, Cole?" Ethan nodded, still breathing hard from the ride, adrenaline making his hands shake just slightly. "I'm fine. But Claire's still at the ranch, alone, and she doesn't know it's over." Garrett's expression softened just a fraction. "Go," he said. "We'll handle this. You get back to her before she thinks the worst." Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come, faster, now that fear wasn't driving him. The prairie opened before him, familiar and vast, and he pushed his mount harder than he probably should have. By the time he reached the ranch, his heart was pounding for different reasons. Not danger, not violence, just the desperate need to tell Claire she was safe, that the men who'd come for her were in federal custody, that for tonight at least the threat had passed. He dismounted at a run, crossed the porch in 3 strides, burst through the door, and went straight to the floor panel. "Claire," he called, his voice rougher than he meant it. "Claire, it's safe, come on up." For a terrible moment, there was no answer. Ethan's chest tightened, his mind racing through awful possibilities. Then he heard movement below, a scraping sound, and the panel shifted. Claire's face appeared in the gap, pale and streaked with tears. Her eyes found his and held. "Ethan," she breathed, like his name was the only prayer she knew. He reached down, helped her up. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip his. When she cleared the opening, she swayed and Ethan caught her. For a moment, she just stood there, supported by his arms, trembling with relief so profound it looked like shock. I thought she started, her voice breaking. I heard the gunshots. I thought they'd killed you. Ethan's arms tightened around her, careful of her injuries, careful of the life growing inside her, but steady, unshakable. I'm here, he said. We're both here. And they're not. Claire pressed her face against his shoulder and finally let herself cry. Not the silent tears of pain, the real sobs of someone who'd been holding terror at bay for hours and could finally let it go. Ethan held her while she shook, while she cried, while the night slowly gave way to the first hints of pre-dawn gray on the eastern horizon. And when she could breathe again, when the tears had slowed to something manageable, she pulled back just enough to look at his face. You came back, she said. Like it was a miracle. I told you I would, Ethan said. People tell me things all the time, Claire whispered. It doesn't make them true. Ethan's hand came up, brushed a strand of hair back from her face with a gentleness that made her breath catch. I'm not people, he said quietly. Claire's eyes searched his, looking for the lie, the angle, the moment when kindness would turn into something with teeth. But all she found was a tired rancher with honest eyes and hands that had protected instead of claimed. No, she said softly, you're not. They stood there in the lamplight, two broken people finding something that felt like trust. Not love, not yet. Love took time and safety and the luxury of believing tomorrow would come. But trust, that was starting. Outside the prairie was silent except for the sounds that belonged there. Wind through grass, horses settling in the corral, the distant call of a coyote announcing dawn. Warren Hayes and his men were in federal custody. The evidence was secured. Marshal Garrett had jurisdiction and the will to use it. For the first time in longer than Claire could remember, the future looked like something other than fear. But she'd learned the hard way not to trust peace too quickly. Men like Warren Hayes didn't give up power easily. They found ways, worked angles, used systems designed to protect them. The battle might be won, but the war was just beginning. And somewhere in a Dodge City jail cell, Warren Hayes sat in the dark making new plans. Plans that involved lawyers and influence, and all the ways a rich man could make problems disappear as even from behind bars. Plans that would force Claire to make the hardest choice of her life, to testify and risk everything or to run and lose it all. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight she was alive. The baby was safe. And a man who barely knew her had risked his life to prove that sometimes, just sometimes, someone would stand up when it mattered. That was enough. For now, it was enough. Dawn came reluctant over the Kansas prairie, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. Claire sat on the porch of Ethan's cabin with a cup of coffee warming her hands, watching the sun climb above the horizon like it was something new. Like yesterday hadn't happened. Like the world was willing to pretend rope and posts and midnight riders were just bad dreams instead of lived reality. Ethan stood a few feet away, leaning against the porch rail, his own coffee growing cold in his grip. Neither had slept. Sleep felt like a luxury for people who didn't have federal cases building around them like storms. The sound of approaching horses made them both tense. Claire's hand went instinctively to her stomach. Ethan's went to the rifle leaning against the wall. But then they saw the riders clearly in the growing light. Marshal Garrett, Dr. Porter, and between them a wagon driven by one of Garrett's deputies. Ethan relaxed fractionally. Claire didn't. Garrett dismounted with the stiff movements of a man who'd been in the saddle most of the night. Porter climbed down from the wagon more carefully, carrying a medical bag in one hand and something else wrapped in cloth in the other. Morning, Garrett said, his voice graveled with exhaustion. Everyone all right here, we're standing, Ethan replied. That's something. Garrett's eyes went to Claire, really looked at her, taking in the exhaustion written on her face, the way she held herself like something that might break if handled wrong. Miss Bennett, he said, I need you to look at something. Porter stepped forward, then unwrapping the cloth to reveal a tin box. Small, battered, the kind of thing you'd use to store nails or tobacco or secrets. Claire's breath caught. Her eyes went wide. You found it. We found it, Garrett confirmed. He gestured to Porter. And Dr. Porter here explains some things that make this case considerably more complicated than I initially thought. Porter looked at Claire with something like apology in his tired eyes. I should have spoken up sooner, he said quietly. Should have stood with you from the beginning. I was afraid. Claire stood slowly, crossed to where Porter held the box. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. You kept it safe, she said. That's what mattered. I did more than that, Porter said. He glanced at Garrett, then back to Claire. I need to tell you something about why I agreed to help you in the first place. They moved inside the cabin. Garrett set the tin box on Ethan's table like it was made of something fragile. Claire sat down across from it, and Ethan took position behind her. Not hovering, just present. Porter remained standing, his hands working against each other like they couldn't quite figure out what to do. 3 years ago, Porter began. My wife Elizabeth took ill. Fever. It came on sudden and burned hot. I knew she needed medicine we didn't have in town. Had to send to Hayes City for it. Sent Deputy Walker with the request, marked it urgent. His voice went rough. Sheriff Morgan held the order for 3 days. Said he was too busy. Said it could wait. But it couldn't wait. By the time the medicine arrived, Elizabeth was gone. Claire made a small sound of sympathy. I found out later, Porter continued, that Morgan had lost money to me in a poker game the week before. $50. He was angry about it. So he delayed my wife's medicine as petty revenge. And she died. Garrett's expression hardened. Did you report this? Porter laughed. It was a bitter sound. To who Morgan was the law? Warren Hayes owned and Morgan. I had no proof, just timing and suspicion. So I buried my wife and I kept my head down, and I hated every single day of living in a town where a man's pride matters more than a woman's life. He looked at Claire. 3 months ago, when you came to my office and asked if I could keep something safe when you told me you were building a case against Warren Hayes, I said yes before you even finished explaining. Because I was tired. Tired of being afraid. Tired of watching evil men call themselves upstanding citizens while bodies piled up in the cemetery. Claire reached across the table, took Porter's hand. Thank you, she said simply. Garrett opened the tin box. Inside were papers, dozens of them, maps, letters, lists written in Claire's careful schoolteacher handwriting. And beneath those, something else, a leather-bound journal. Garrett lifted the journal carefully, opened it. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second. Then he went very still. Miss Bennett, he said slowly, when you wrote to me, you said you had evidence of 6 murders. Claire nodded. 6 that I could prove with documentation or witness statements. Garrett looked up at her. There are 12 in here. The words fell into the cabin like stones into still water. Ripples spreading outward in widening circles of horror. 12, Claire whispered. She looked stricken. I only knew about 6. The rest are all documented, Garrett finished, with dates, names, methods, some going back 15 years. He started reading aloud, his voice flat, professional. The only way to get through a litany of murder without breaking. Thomas Drummond, 1877, marked as riding accident. Witness statement says saddle girth was tampered with. Miguel Reyes, 1883, shot, buried in South Pasture. Witness statement from ranch hand Ben Perez, James Bennett, 1876. Claire's head snapped up. That's my father. Garrett met her eyes. I know. The journal notes that Bennett contested a land sale, claimed forgery on the deed transfer, died 3 weeks later in what was called a riding accident. Your father's horse allegedly spooked and threw him, broke his neck. Claire's hand went to her mouth, her whole body shaking. I was 8 years old, she whispered. They told me it was an accident, that he was drinking and got careless, but he didn't drink. He never drank. Ethan's hand came to rest on her shoulder, steady, grounding. Garrett continued through the list. 12 names, 12 deaths, each one ruled accidental or natural, each one convenient for Warren Hayes, each one removing an obstacle to land acquisition or silencing a witness or eliminating a competitor. By the time he finished, Porter had sat down heavily on Ethan's other chair, his face gray. 12, Porter said. Dear God, I knew Warren was corrupt. I didn't know he was a serial killer. Garrett closed the journal. This changes everything, he said. This isn't just fraud and land theft anymore. This is a capital murder case. Multiple counts, federal jurisdiction, because some of these victims were on federal land grants. He looked at Claire. You're not just a witness anymore, Miss Bennett. You're the key to putting a noose around Warren Hayes' neck. And he knows it. The morning stretched on. Garrett went through every piece of evidence in the tin box methodically, made notes, asked Claire questions about where she'd found certain documents, who had provided witness statements, how she'd connected the dots between deaths and land transfers. Claire answered as best she could, but Ethan could see the toll it was taking, the way her hands shook, the way her voice would catch when reading her father's name in her own handwriting, the protective way she held her stomach like she could shield the life growing there from the ugliness of the past. Around mid-morning, there was another sound of horses. This time, Deputy Walker rode up alone. He dismounted slowly, and Ethan noticed the man wasn't wearing his badge anymore. Walker stood at the bottom of the porch steps looking up at Garrett with the expression of a man who'd made a hard choice and was still figuring out how to live with it. Marshal Walker said, "I came to make a statement." Garrett studied him. "You understand that anything you say can be used in court?" "I understand." Walker took a breath. "I've been deputy in Dodge City for 4 years. For 3 of those years, I've watched Sheriff Morgan take money from Warren Hayes. Watched him look the other way when Hayes' men moved cattle at night. Watched him file false reports and destroy evidence and lie under oath." He pulled a small leather book from his coat. "This is Sheriff Morgan's personal ledger. I copied it 2 years ago when I started to understand what I was part of. Every payment Hayes made to Morgan, every favor, every crime Morgan helped cover up." He held it out to Garrett. "I'm done being part of it. I quit this morning. Turned in my badge. But before I left, I took this from Morgan's locked drawer. Figured you'd need it." Garrett took the ledger, flipped through it, his expression growing grimmer with each page. "This is comprehensive," he said. Walker nodded. "Morgan kept good records, thought it made him smart. Thought maybe he could use it as leverage against Hayes if things ever went bad. But mostly I think he just liked keeping score." "Why now?" Garrett asked. "Why turn on them now?" Walker's eyes went to Claire. "Because I stood in Dr. Porter's office yesterday and watched Warren Hayes try to claim a woman he'd had tied to posts like an animal. Watched him smile while doing it. And I realized that if I kept following orders, eventually I'd be the one tying the rope." He swallowed hard. "My father was a lawman, a real one. He taught me that the badge means something, that you're supposed to protect people, not power. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that. Yesterday reminded me." Garrett closed the ledger. "You'll need to testify in federal court against both Morgan and Hayes." "I know," Walker said. "And I will." The pieces were coming together, the evidence mounting, but Ethan could see something else forming too. Could see the way Garrett's mind was working through logistics and timing and the 100 ways this could still go wrong. "We have a problem," Garrett said finally. "We have overwhelming evidence, but we need time to build the case properly. Need to get testimony from witnesses, verified documents, establish chain of custody. That takes days, maybe weeks. And Warren's not going to sit quiet in a cell for weeks," Ethan said. "Exactly," Garrett confirmed. "He's got money, lawyers, influence. He'll make bail within 48 hours. And the moment he's out, he becomes exponentially more dangerous." Claire's voice was quiet but steady. "He'll try to kill me." Garrett didn't insult her by denying it. "Yes," he said, "he will." "Then what do we do?" Porter asked. Garrett thought for a long moment. Then he looked at Ethan. How defensible is this ranch, Ethan considered. One man could hold it for a while. 2 would be better. But if Hayes comes with enough guns, eventually the math stops working in our favor. "I can post deputies," Garrett said. "Keep you protected until the trial." "Warren owns half this county," Claire said. She was learning to think like someone who'd survived too much to be naive anymore. "He'll find out where your deputies sleep, what they eat, who they care about, and he'll use that. Then we move you," Garrett said. "Take you to Topeka, put you in federal protection." Claire shook her head. "I run, I lose my father's land. I lose everything I've been fighting for. And Warren wins even if he hangs." Ethan's hand tightened on her shoulder. "You don't have to choose between staying alive and getting justice. There's got to be another way." Before anyone could respond, they heard it. The distant sound of raised voices, carrying across the prairie from the direction of town. Too far to make out words, but close enough to hear anger. Garrett stood, moved to the window. Something's happening in Dodge City. They rode into town an hour later. Garrett, Ethan, and Claire with Porter driving the wagon behind them. Walker had gone ahead to scout, and he met them at the edge of Main Street with news. Warren called a town meeting, Walker said, at the church. Got half of Dodge City in there right now, saying what Garrett asked. That you're a federal tyrant overstepping your bounds. That Claire's a troublemaker who's been lying about good men to cover up her own crimes. That this is all some kind of conspiracy to steal land from honest folks. Claire's jaw set. He's turning it around, making himself the victim. It's what men like him do, Garrett said grimly. Can't fight the evidence, so they fight the narrative. They approached the church carefully, could hear Warren's voice now amplified by righteous indignation in the acoustics of the building. This federal marshal comes into our town, Warren was saying, and arrests upstanding citizens on the word of one bitter woman, a woman who's been making wild accusations for months, a woman who consorts with a known recluse and claims to be carrying evidence that mysteriously no one has ever seen. Murmurs of agreement from parts of the crowd. But then another voice rose. Female, strong, cutting through the rumble like a knife. That's a lie, Warren Hayes, and you know it. Martha Whitmore stood up from her pew, 52 years old and done with staying quiet. I've lived in this town 30 years, Martha said, her voice carrying to every corner of the church. I've watched you take land from families who couldn't fight back. Watched you buy the sheriff and twist the law to suit yourself. And I've kept my mouth shut because I was afraid. She looked around at the other townspeople. We've all been afraid. Afraid if we spoke up, we'd lose our businesses, our homes, our safety. So we looked away while Warren Hayes turned Dodge City into his personal kingdom. Warren's face darkened. Mrs. Whitmore, you're confused. I'm not confused, Martha shot back. I'm ashamed. Shamed it took a federal marshal and a schoolteacher braver than any of us to finally stand up to you. Other women started standing, slowly at first. The pastor's wife, a widow who ran the general store, a seamstress whose husband worked one of Warren's ranches. We're tired of being afraid, one of them said. We know what you did to Claire Bennett, said another, and we're not going to pretend anymore. Warren's control snapped, his face going red with rage. You women don't know what you're talking about. This is men's business, land and law and commerce. You should go home and tend to your households. Martha smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. Funny thing about households, Mr. Hayes, women are the ones who know what happens inside them, who sees the bruises wives try to hide, who hears about the threats men make when they think we're not listening, who remembers every wrong done because we're the ones who have to live with the consequences while you men call it business. The church had gone silent, everyone watching this quiet rebellion unfold. Warren looked around, saw his support crumbling, saw the careful structure of fear and compliance he'd built starting to crack. He stood abruptly. This meeting is over, he said. You don't get to decide that anymore, Martha replied. Warren pushed past people to get to the aisle, pushed hard enough that an older man stumbled. And that's when Garrett stepped into the church doorway, blocking Warren's exit. Mr. Hayes, Garrett said calmly, I think you should stay and listen to what these people have to say about the town you claim to care so much about. Warren's hand twitched toward his coat, toward where a man might carry a weapon. Don't, Garrett said quietly, his hand resting on his own pistol. You're already facing 12 counts of murder. Don't add assaulting a federal officer to the list. Warren froze, and in that moment of stillness, everyone in the church saw what Claire had been trying to tell them all along, saw the violence beneath the polish, the monster under the clean shirt. Warren Hayes wasn't a pillar of the community. He was a killer who'd gotten away with it for 15 years because everyone was too afraid to call him what he was. That evening back at the ranch, Claire stood on the porch watching the sun go down. Ethan joined her, 2 cups of coffee in hand. They'd become a ritual, these quiet moments at day's end. It's not over, Claire said. Warren made bail this afternoon. Garrett told me. He's out. Ethan nodded. He'd heard. Garrett's got deputies watching him. And watching you. Hayes makes a move, we'll know. Claire's hand went to her stomach. I keep thinking about my father, she said quietly. How he stood up to Warren. How it got him killed. How I'm doing the exact same thing, except now there's a baby to think about. She looked at Ethan. Am I being selfish, risking my child for justice? Ethan thought about that, about Sarah, about the child she'd been carrying when she died, about all the might-have-beens that haunted quiet men in Kansas. I think he said slowly that you're trying to build a world where your child can grow up without learning to look away from evil. That doesn't sound selfish to me. But what if I lose? Then at least you fought, Ethan said. At least your child will grow up knowing their mother stood for something. That's a legacy Warren Hayes will never have. Claire was quiet for a long moment. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder. Just for a second. Just long enough to borrow some of his certainty. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. You don't have to thank me for doing what's right. Most people would have ridden past those posts. Ethan's arm came around her shoulders. Careful. Protective. I'm not most people, he said. And in the distance, in a fine house in Dodge City, Warren Hayes sat with his expensive lawyers and made plans. Plans that involved fire and darkness and making problems disappear. Plans that would test how much justice could survive when power decided it had been patient long enough. The storm was coming, and everyone knew it. The next 3 days passed in a tension that felt like waiting for thunder after seeing lightning. Warren Hayes walked free on bail, his expensive lawyers having convinced a judge that he was a pillar of the community, not a flight risk, surely entitled to prepare his defense from the comfort of his own home. The fact that this same judge had received a generous donation to his re-election campaign 2 years prior was, everyone agreed, purely coincidental. Marshal Garrett stationed 2 deputies at Ethan's ranch. Good men, federal men. But even they looked nervous when the sun went down, and the prairie went quiet in that particular way it goes quiet when predators are moving. Claire spent her days giving formal depositions, going through the evidence piece by piece with Garrett and a federal prosecutor who'd arrived from Topeka. A sharp woman named Catherine Brennan, who had a reputation for putting corrupt men behind bars and didn't much care how powerful they thought they were. Brennan sat across from Claire in Ethan's cabin, papers spread across the table like accusations waiting to be filed. The trial is set for 2 weeks from now, Brennan said. Federal court in Dodge City, Judge Harrison Caldwell presiding. He's fair, tough, won't be swayed by Hayes's money or connections. She paused. But you need to understand what you're walking into, Miss Bennett. Hayes will have the best defense attorney money can buy. They'll tear into every piece of evidence. They'll question your motives, your character, your mental state. They'll suggest you fabricated everything out of spite or madness or some twisted desire for attention. Claire's jaw set. Let them try. Brennan smiled. It was a wolf's smile. That's what I wanted to hear. But there's something else you should know. Hayes is making moves, trying to intimidate potential witnesses. We've had 3 people who were going to testify suddenly remember they didn't see anything after all. Who? Claire asked. 2 ranch hands who were going to corroborate the cattle theft. And Ben Torres, the man who witnessed the Miguel Reyes murder. Claire's face went pale. Torres was our strongest witness. Without him, we still have the journal entries, Brennan said. We still have the land records. We still have 12 bodies in a pattern of deaths that all benefited one man. But yes, it would have been better with Torres. What happened to him? He got an offer, Brennan said flatly. $20,000 to leave Kansas and forget what he saw. His family struggled for years, that kind of money. I can't blame him for taking it. But Claire could see the frustration in Brennan's eyes, could see how this case was already being chipped away at the edges by money and fear and the machinery that protected men like Warren Hayes. That night, Martha Whitmore came to the ranch with news. She arrived after dark driving her wagon alone, despite the danger, and her face was set with the kind of determination that came from making hard choices. She gathered everyone in the cabin. Ethan, Claire, Garrett, the 2 federal deputies. Dr. Porter, who'd become a fixture at these meetings, his earlier cowardice transformed into stubborn courage. I've been talking to the women in town, Martha said without preamble. The ones who stood up in the church. We've been meeting quietly, sharing stories. And I think you need to hear what we know. She pulled out a small notebook. Her own handwriting filled the pages. Emma Hartley. Martha read. Her husband worked for Hayes 5 years ago. He saw something he shouldn't have seen, some kind of meeting between Hayes and men from the railroad. He told Emma about it. 2 days later, he had an accident at the ranch, crushed by a horse. Emma's been too afraid to say anything until now. She flipped a page. Rebecca Stone. Her father contested a property line with Hayes back in '79. Hired a lawyer, was preparing to take it to court. The lawyer died of food poisoning the night before the hearing. The case was dismissed. Rebecca's father gave up. sold the land to Hayes for a quarter of what it was worth. Martha went through 6 more stories. 6 more suspicious deaths or convenient accidents or sudden changes of heart that all resulted in Warren Hayes getting what he wanted. These women will testify, Martha said. If you can promise to keep them safe. Garrett leaned forward. Mrs. Whitmore, you understand what you're asking. These women put themselves in Hayes's crosshairs. Their families, too. Martha's eyes were steel. We're already in his crosshairs, Marshal. We've just been pretending we're not. At least this way we're shooting back. The next day, Ethan rode into town for supplies. He didn't usually go to Dodge City anymore, hadn't for years, but they were running low on coffee and ammunition, and some things couldn't be put off just because evil men made threats. He was leaving the general store when Jack Drummond appeared. Not threatening, not armed that Ethan could see, just standing there on the boardwalk like he'd been waiting. "Cole," Jack said, his voice quiet. "Can I talk to you?" Ethan's hand stayed near his pistol. "Talk." Jack looked around, made sure they were alone. "Warren's planning something," he said. "Something bad. I don't know all the details, but I heard him talking to some men I don't know, outsiders, the kind you hire when local help won't do what needs doing." "Why are you telling me this?" Jack's face was haggard. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. "Because I'm done," he said simply. "Done being the man who does terrible things and calls it loyalty. When I got arrested, when I sat in that cell and realized Warren was going to let me hang for his crimes, something broke. Or maybe something got fixed. I don't know." He took a breath. "I can't undo what I've done. Can't bring back the people I've hurt. But maybe I can stop him from hurting more." "What's he planning?" Ethan asked. Jack shook his head. "I don't know specifics, but it involves fire, and it involves making the evidence disappear, and it involves making sure Miss Bennett doesn't make it to trial." When soon, Jack said, "Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow." But soon, Ethan studied him, trying to decide if this was genuine or some kind of elaborate trap. "You could be lying. I could be," Jack agreed, "but I'm not. And if you're smart, you'll get Miss Bennett somewhere safe until this is over." "Why should I trust you?" "You shouldn't," Jack said. "But Warren killed my father, made it look like an accident. I was 18. I saw him do it. Saw him loosen the saddle girth while my father was inside getting his gear. Watched my father mount up and ride out, and then watch the horse spook and my father fall and his neck break when he hit the ground." His voice went rough. "And then Warren offered me a job. Said my father would want him to look after me. Said he'd make sure I was taken care of. And I was so young and so scared and so alone that I took it. Spent 20 years working for the man who murdered my father because I didn't know what else to do." He met Ethan's eyes. "I can't bring my father back. Can't fix what I've become. But I can tell you what I know. And I can testify against Warren Hayes. Put him on the gallows where he belongs." Ethan considered, then nodded once. "Federal courthouse. Tomorrow morning. Ask for Marshal Garrett. Tell him what you told me." Jack nodded. "One more thing," he said. "The men Warren hired, they're not from Kansas. They're from Missouri. Professional killers. The kind who don't ask questions and don't leave witnesses." "How many for?" Jack said. "Maybe 5. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Him and 2 federal deputies against 4 or 5 professional guns. The math didn't work. "Thank you," Ethan said. "Don't thank me yet," Jack replied. "I haven't earned that." He turned to go, then stopped. "Miss Bennett," he said. "She's brave. Braver than most men I've known. You make sure she lives through this." "You hear me?" "I intend to," Ethan said. That night they prepared. Garrett brought in 2 more deputies from Hayes City, positioned them around the ranch in a defensive perimeter, checked weapons, made sure everyone knew their fields of fire, turned Ethan's small ranch into something approximating a fortress. Claire watched the preparations from the cabin window, her hand resting on her stomach. "This is because of me," she said quietly. Ethan looked up from where he was loading rifle cartridges. "This is because of Warren Hayes," he corrected. "You just had the courage to stand up to him. People are going to die. People have already died," Ethan said. 12 that we know about, probably more. At least now they're dying for something that matters." Claire turned from the window. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Good," Ethan said. "Fear keeps you careful, keeps you alive." He stood, crossed to her, took her hands in his. But don't let fear make you doubt what you're doing. You're fighting for your child, for your father, for every person Warren Hayes has crushed under his boot. That's worth being afraid for. Claire's eyes filled. What if I lose the baby? The stress, the danger, what if? Then we deal with that if it happens, Ethan said. But right now, today, that baby's still safe. Still growing, still fighting to be born. Just like you're fighting. He paused. You're the strongest person I've met, Claire Bennett. And I don't say that lightly. Claire leaned into him then, let herself be held, let herself take comfort in the solid reality of someone who didn't want anything from her except her survival. They stayed like that for a long moment. Two people who'd found each other in the worst possible circumstances, learning that sometimes strength comes from admitting you can't do it alone. Outside, night fell. The moon rose. And somewhere in Dodge City, 5 men checked their weapons and mounted horses and rode out toward Ethan Cole's ranch with orders to burn everything and leave no witnesses. The attack came at midnight. Not subtle, not quiet, just sudden violence announced by the smell of kerosene and the whoosh of flame catching on wood. The barn went first. Ethan's deputies had been watching the house and the attackers knew it. They lit the barn to draw attention, to pull defenders out of position, to create chaos in the dark. It worked. One of Garrett's deputies ran toward the barn and a rifle shot cracked across the yard. The deputy went down clutching his leg, not dead, but out of the fight. Ethan shoved Claire toward the floor hatch. Go, he said. Now I can help, she protested. You can survive, Ethan corrected. That's the help I need. She went, disappeared into the dark space beneath the floor. And Ethan turned to face what was coming. More shots, from multiple directions, professional, coordinated. These weren't Warren's usual thugs. These were men who killed for money and did it well. Garrett was shouting orders, organizing the defense. But they were outnumbered and outgunned, and everyone knew it. Then from the darkness beyond the firelight, a voice called out. Not one of the attackers. Someone else. Federal Marshal. Hold your fire. Ethan risked a look. Saw figures approaching from the east. A lot of figures. On foot. Carrying rifles but not shooting. Garrett saw them too. His weapon trained on the approaching group until they got close enough for the firelight to show their faces. Women. 20 of them. Maybe more. Led by Martha Whitmore with a rifle in her hands that looked like it had seen service in the war. We heard shooting, Martha called. Figured you could use help. Behind her were the pastor's wife, the general store widow, the seamstress. Women who'd spent years being quiet and afraid. Women who'd decided that enough was enough. The attackers hadn't expected this, hadn't planned for the town itself to turn against them. They retreated, melting back into the darkness, firing a few more covering shots before disappearing entirely. The barn burned, they couldn't save it. But the house stood, the people inside lived. And when dawn came gray and cold over the prairie, Ethan found himself surrounded by women he barely knew. Women who'd risked everything to stand between him and violence. Martha approached him as the sun climbed higher. Hayes sent those men, she said. It wasn't a question. Probably, Ethan agreed. Then it's time we finish this, Martha said. The trial starts in 10 days. We'll make sure every woman in this county knows to be there. To watch. To witness. To make sure justice actually happens for once. She looked at the smoldering barn. He can burn our buildings, she said, but he can't burn what we know. Can't burn the truth. Ethan thought about Sarah, about Claire, about 12 dead people and a tin box full of evidence, and a baby not yet born who deserved better than a world where murder was legal if you had enough money. No, he agreed. He can't. Inside the cabin, Claire emerged from beneath the floor, shaking but alive. Ethan helped her up and she looked at the women gathered in the yard with something like awe. They came, she whispered. They actually came. Told you there were more folks willing to stand up than Warren thinks, Ethan said. Claire moved to the door, stepped out onto the porch. The women turned to look at her, battered, pregnant, defiant. Everything Warren Hayes had tried to destroy and failed. Thank you, Claire said, her voice breaking. Thank you. We should have stood up sooner, Martha replied. Should have stopped him years ago. But we're here now and we're not going anywhere. The trial was 10 days away. Warren Hayes had tried violence and failed, had tried intimidation and failed, had tried every weapon in his arsenal except the one he was about to deploy. The law itself, twisted and shaped and wielded by men who knew how to make injustice look legal. The real battle was about to begin. The federal courthouse in Dodge City had never seen a crowd like this. People lined up before dawn wanting seats for what everyone was calling the trial of the century. Women in their Sunday dresses, men in their cleanest shirts. Children kept home from school because their parents understood they were about to witness history. Judge Harrison Caldwell took the bench at 9 o'clock sharp, 65 years old, white beard trimmed military precise, eyes that had seen every trick defense lawyers could pull and weren't impressed by any of them. He surveyed the packed courtroom with the expression of a man who knew exactly how important this moment was and refused to let anyone forget it. Warren Hayes sat at the defense table in an expensive suit flanked by two lawyers from Kansas City who cost more per hour than most men in Dodge City made in a month. He looked calm, composed, like a man who'd bought his way out of trouble before and saw no reason why this time would be different. Claire sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, Ethan beside her. Her pregnancy was visible now at nearly 5 months, and she held herself with the careful dignity of someone who knew the entire town was watching. Prosecutor Catherine Brennan stood to give her opening statement. She was 40 years old, earned gray hair pulled back severe, and when she spoke, every word landed like a hammer. Ladies and gentlemen, Brennan began over the next several days. You will hear evidence of a conspiracy spanning 15 years, evidence of 12 murders, evidence of systematic fraud and land theft, evidence of a man who believed that money and power put him above the law. She gestured to the evidence table where the tin box sat alongside maps and ledgers and the damning journal. But this case is about more than Warren Hayes' crimes. It's about what happens when good people choose silence over courage, when communities choose comfort over justice, and what happens when one woman decides that enough is enough. The defense attorney, a man named Gerald Finch, gave his opening with practiced smoothness, suggested Claire was mentally unstable, suggested the evidence was fabricated, suggested this was all some elaborate scheme motivated by greed or madness or revenge. The jury listened. 12 men from surrounding counties carefully selected because they had no business connections to Warren Hayes. They looked skeptical of both sides. Good. The first day was testimony from Marshall Garrett, methodical presentation of evidence, maps showing boundary shifts, deeds with forged signatures, the timeline of deaths and land acquisitions that followed the same pattern over and over. The second day brought Dr. Porter. He testified about Claire's injuries from the posts, about his wife's death and Sheriff Morgan's role in it, about becoming Claire's secret ally because he was tired of living in fear. The third day, Jack Drummond took the stand. Every conversation stopped as he walked up. Everyone knew who he was, Warren's enforcer, the man who'd done the dirty work for 20 years. And now here he was about to turn on his master. Brennan led him through his testimony carefully. His father's death, the loosened saddle girth, Warren's calculated recruitment of a grieving 18-year-old boy, the years of being used, the midnight rides, the intimidation, the violence, and finally the note Warren had written ordering Claire's retrieval. Jack's voice was steady as he recounted it all. No tears, no dramatics, just the flat recitation of a man who'd done terrible things and was finally naming them for what they were. When the defense attorney cross-examined, he went for the throat. Mr. Drummond, isn't it true you're testifying in exchange for a reduced sentence? Yes, Jack said. So you have every motivation to lie, to tell the prosecution what they want to hear. I have every motivation to finally tell the truth, Jack corrected. I spent 20 years lying. For Warren Hayes. For money. For fear. I'm done. The defense attorney tried to shake him. Couldn't. Jack had made his choice and there was no going back. The fourth day was Claire's turn. She walked to the witness stand with her head high, one hand resting on her stomach. The bailiff swore her in and she sat down facing a courtroom full of people who'd watched her be tied to posts 6 weeks ago. Brennan approached gently. Miss Bennett, please tell the court why you began investigating county land records. Claire took a breath. 2 years ago, I was planning to buy land outside town, a small plot where I could build a house and raise my child. But when I researched the property, I discovered it had been my father's land. Land he'd supposedly sold willingly to Warren Hayes in 1876. She paused. But I remembered differently. I was 8 years old when my father died. I remembered him fighting the sale. Remembered him telling my mother the deed was a forgery. Remembered Warren Hayes coming to our house with papers and my father's anger. 3 weeks later, my father was dead. Riding accident, they said. And you didn't believe it was an accident. I was a child. I didn't know what to believe. But when I moved back to Dodge City as an adult and saw the pattern, saw other families losing land, the same way I saw other convenient accidents, I couldn't look away. Brennan nodded. What did you do? I started documenting, Claire said. Every land transfer, every death that benefited Warren Hayes, every forged signature. It took 18 months. I worked alone at first. Then Dr. Porter helped me keep the evidence safe. Why didn't you go to the local sheriff? Because Sheriff Morgan was on Warren's payroll, Claire said simply. Everyone knew it. Going to him would have been suicide. So you wrote to the federal authorities, yes, 2 months before what happened to me. Brennan moved to stand beside the evidence table. Miss Bennett, on August 7th of this year, you were found tied to fence posts outside town. Can you tell the court how that happened? Claire's hands tightened on the arms of the witness chair. This was the moment, the truth she'd been holding back even from Ethan. I let them catch me, she said quietly. The courtroom erupted. Judge Caldwell's gavel came down hard. Order Brennan's eyebrows rose, but she kept her voice steady. You let them. Can you explain? Claire looked directly at Warren Hayes for the first time. I had most of the evidence I needed, she said. But I needed one more thing. Proof that Warren Hayes ordered violence against those who opposed him. Proof he didn't just steal through paperwork, but through fear. So what did you do? I provoked him, Claire said, publicly, at the general store, asked him pointed questions about land records in front of witnesses. Made it clear I wasn't going to be quiet. Made it clear I was a threat. Her voice stayed steady. I knew he'd retaliate. Knew he couldn't afford to let me keep asking questions. So I gave him the opportunity to show everyone exactly what kind of man he was. You deliberately put yourself in danger, Brennan said. Yes. Why? Because I was tired of living in a world where evil men prospered because good people were too afraid to name what they were seeing. Because I wanted my child to grow up in a place where justice meant something. She took a breath. I didn't anticipate how much it would hurt. Didn't understand what hours on those posts would do to a body. Didn't factor in that I was pregnant and the stress could kill my baby. That was foolish. Reckless, maybe. Her eyes blazed. But it worked. It forced Warren Hayes out of the shadows. Made him do his own dirty work for once. And when Ethan Cole cut me down, there were witnesses who couldn't pretend they hadn't seen. The defense attorney stood for cross-examination. He tried everything. Suggested she was lying about the pregnancy. Suggested she'd fabricated the evidence. Suggested she was mentally unstable. Claire met every accusation with calm facts, with documentation, with a simple truth that she'd been willing to sacrifice everything because someone had to. Finally, against his lawyer's advice, Warren Hayes demanded to take the stand. It was a mistake. The kind of mistake arrogant men make when they've never faced real consequences. Brennan was merciless. She walked him through the journal entries, made him explain why 12 people who opposed him all died accidentally, made him explain the forged signatures, the shifted boundaries, the cattle that disappeared from one ranch and appeared on his with fresh brands. And Warren, who'd spent decades believing his own lies, started to crack. When Brennan showed him the entry about Miguel Reyes, Warren snapped. That Mexican was squatting on my land, he shouted. My land? I built this county from nothing. The deed shows he purchased the property in 1880, Brennan said calmly. Deeds can be wrong or forged. By you. Warren's face went purple. I made Dodge City what it is. Before me, it was nothing. Every business, every building, every inch of prosperity came because I had the vision and the strength to make it happen. By killing 12 people, Brennan asked. By doing what was necessary. Not a breath was drawn. Even Warren's lawyers looked stunned. Judge Caldwell leaned forward. Mr. Hayes, are you confessing to these murders? Warren seemed to realize what he'd said. His mouth opened, closed, but the damage was done. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood with a piece of paper that trembled slightly in his hand. Guilty, on all counts. Warren Hayes stood as the verdict was read, his face ashen. For the first time in his life, money and power weren't enough to save him. Judge Caldwell sentenced him immediately. Warren Hayes, you are hereby sentenced to death by hanging for the murders of Thomas Drummond, Miguel Reyes, James Bennett, and 9 others. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none. Warren was led away in chains, still protesting, still insisting he'd done nothing wrong. The courtroom watched in silence as justice delayed by 15 years finally arrived. Outside, Claire stood on the courthouse steps with Ethan beside her. The women of Dodge City surrounded them. Martha Whitmore, the pastor's wife, the seamstress, all the women who'd found their voices. It's over, Martha said. Claire shook her head. It's just beginning. The hard part is living with what we've learned about our town, about ourselves, about how long we let this go on. But we stopped it, the pastor's wife said. Finally. Claire's hand went to her stomach. The baby kicked strong and insistent. Yes, she said. We did. 3 months later, on a cold December morning, Warren Hayes was hanged in the town square. Claire didn't attend. Neither did Ethan. Some endings didn't need witnesses, but they heard about it later. Heard that Warren's last words were still proclaiming his innocence, still insisting he'd been the victim of conspiracy and lies. Some men Ethan observed never learned to see themselves clearly. Claire, 8 months pregnant now, and showing nodded. But at least they can't hurt anyone else. She looked at Ethan. Really looked at him. This man who'd stopped when everyone else rode past, who'd listened when she said it hurt, who'd protected her when she had nothing to offer him in return. I never properly thanked you, she said. You don't need to. I do, Claire insisted. You saved my life, my baby's life. You stood up when you didn't have to. Ethan's hand found hers. I had every reason to, he said quietly. And in that moment, on a porch in Kansas with winter coming, and justice finally served, something shifted between them. Something that had been building since the moment he cut her down from those posts. Not gratitude, not obligation, something real. The baby chose that moment to kick hard enough that Claire gasped. Ethan's hand moved instinctively to her stomach, and for the first time he felt it. The life Claire was carrying, the future they'd both fought to protect. Strong, he said, takes after the mother. Claire laughed. It was the first real laugh Ethan had heard from her, the sound of healing beginning. 1 month later, in January of 1888, Claire gave birth to a daughter at Ethan's ranch. Daughter Porter delivered the baby, while Martha Whitmore assisted, and Ethan paced outside like men have paced since the beginning of time. When he was finally allowed in, Claire was propped up on pillows, exhausted and radiant, holding a tiny bundle. Her name is Sarah Elizabeth, Claire said, after your sister, and after the pastor's wife who stood with us. Ethan looked at the baby, at Claire, at this unexpected family that had formed from tragedy and courage. She's perfect, he said. Claire smiled. Come here, she said. Ethan approached carefully. Remember when I told you not to touch there because it still hurt? Yes. Claire took his hand, placed it on her shoulder. The same shoulder that had been wrenched in the ropes, the place that had been too painful to bear contact. It doesn't hurt anymore, she said softly. You can touch here now. And Ethan understood. This wasn't just about physical healing. It was about trust rebuilt, about learning that not all hands brought pain, about the slow, hard work of letting someone in after trauma tried to wall you off forever. He sat beside her on the bed. His arm went around her shoulders. She leaned into him, and they sat like that for a long time, watching Sarah sleep, watching the future they'd fought for, breathe and dream. Outside, spring was coming to Kansas. The prairie would green soon. New life pushing up through old ground, the way it always did, the way it always would. And in Dodge City, things were changing too. Slowly, a new sheriff had been elected. The women who'd found their voices weren't giving them up. The land stolen by Warren Hayes was being returned piece by piece to the families who'd lost it. It wasn't perfect. Change never is. But it was better, and better was enough to build on. The years that followed taught them both what healing really looked like. Not dramatic, not sudden, just the slow daily work of choosing trust over fear, of building something new from broken pieces. Ethan never remarried, though Claire asked him once why not. He'd smiled and said he'd already found what he needed. A family built not from obligation, but from choice. From two broken people who'd learned that sometimes the best things come from the worst moments if you're brave enough to let them. Claire taught school in Dodge City for 32 more years. Raised Sarah Elizabeth to be a woman who asked questions and demanded answers, who stood up when others looked away. who understood that justice wasn't given, it was fought for. And sometimes on quiet evenings, Ethan and Claire would sit on that porch where they'd first learned to trust each other, and Claire would rest her hand on that shoulder where rope had once burned, where pain had lived, where healing had begun. "You can touch here now," she'd said once so many years ago. And he still did. Careful, gentle, with the kind of reverence that comes from understanding what it costs to let someone in after trauma tried to wall you off forever. The prairie stretched endless before them. The same prairie where posts had stood like warnings, where rope had bitten flesh, where one man had chosen not to ride past. And in that choice, everything had changed, not just for Claire, not just for Ethan, but for every person in Dodge City who'd learned that silence wasn't safety, that looking away didn't make you innocent, that sometimes the hardest thing in the world is also the most necessary thing: to stand, to speak, to refuse to let evil call itself order. Warren Hayes was hanged on December 3rd, 1887. The town witnessed it in silence, some in satisfaction, some in shame, and all in the knowledge that justice, however delayed, had finally arrived. Claire Bennett taught school until 1920, shaping 3 generations of children who grew up knowing that one woman's courage could change an entire town. She died peacefully in her sleep at age 63, with Sarah Elizabeth holding her hand. Ethan Cole never remarried. He lived quietly on his ranch until 1911, when age finally caught what violence never could. His last words were Sarah's name, both of them, the sister he'd failed, the daughter he'd helped protect, and Sarah Elizabeth. She became a lawyer, spent her life defending those without voices, married late, raised children who knew their grandmother's story, who understood that the legacy of courage isn't inherited, it's chosen. The posts were torn down 3 days after Claire's rescue, burned by townspeople who couldn't bear to look at them anymore. The ashes scattered on the prairie wind, but the story survived, passed down in whispers and warnings, and eventually in the proud recitation of those who understood what it meant. That once, in a small Kansas town, evil wore clean shirts and called itself respectable, and one school teacher said no. One rancher stopped. One marshal brought daylight. And together they proved that sometimes the hardest truths are the simplest ones. Don't look away. Don't stay silent. And when someone whispers, "It still hurts there," listen, because that's where healing begins.